Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be doing something a little bit different. This week, we will be reading the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta in its entirety and discussing it. It is part of the Pali Canon in the Samyutta Nikaya, which is one of the oldest collections of Buddhist texts. We are using the version translated into English by Bhikku Bodhi. The name of this text translates to setting the Dharma wheel in motion. The Dharma wheel is spinning when a Buddha has arisen in the world and is giving some great enlightening teaching. Indeed, this is the Buddha's first sermon after reaching Buddhahood, where he lays out the middle way, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path. We hope you enjoy. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Varanasi in the deer park at Isipatana. There the Blessed One addressed the bhikkhus of the group of 5 thus. Bhikkhus, these two extremes should not be followed by one who has gone forth into homelessness. What two? The pursuit of sensual happiness and sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of worldlings, ignoble, unbeneficial, and the pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. And what, bhikkhus, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana? It is the Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This, bhikkhus, is that middle way awakened to by the Tathagata, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of suffering. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, union with what is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates, subject to clinging, are suffering. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is this craving which leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. That is, craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of it, freedom from it, non-reliance on it. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. It is the Noble Eightfold Path, that is, right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This is the noble truth of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me a vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering is to be abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the origin of suffering has been abandoned. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering is to be realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the cessation of suffering has been realized. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This is the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering is to be developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. This noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering has been developed. Thus, bhikkhus, in regard to things unheard before, there arose in me vision, knowledge, wisdom, true knowledge, and light. So long, bhikkhus, as my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths as they really are, in their 3 phases and 12 aspects, was not thoroughly purified in this way, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. But when my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths as they really are, in their 3 phases and 12 aspects was thoroughly purified in this way, then I claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this generation with its ascetics and Brahmins, its devas and humans. The knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. Now there is no more renewed existence. This is what the Blessed One said. Elated, the bhikkhus of the group of 5 delighted in the Blessed One's statement. And while this discourse was being spoken, there arose in the Venerable Kondana the dust-free, stainless vision of the Dhamma. Whatever is subject to origination is all subject to cessation. And then the wheel of the Dhamma had been set in motion by the Blessed One. The earth-dwelling devas raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin, or Deva or Mara, or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. Having heard the cry of the earth-dwelling devas, the devas in the realm of the 4 great kings raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin, or Deva, or Mara, or by anyone in the world. Having heard the cry of the devas of the realm of the 4 great kings, the Tavatimsa devas, the Yama devas, the Tushita devas, the Nimanarati devas, the Paranimita Vasavati devas, the devas of the Brahma's company raised a cry. At Varanasi, in the deer park, at Isipatana, this unsurpassed wheel of the Dhamma has been set in motion by the Blessed One, which cannot be stopped by any ascetic or Brahmin or Deva or Mara or Brahma, or by anyone in the world. Thus, at that moment, at that instant, at that second, the cry spread as far as the Brahma world, and this 10,000-fold world system shook, quaked, and trembled, and an immeasurable glorious radiance appeared in the world, surpassing the divine majesty of the devas. Then the Blessed One uttered this inspired utterance. Kondana has indeed understood. Kondana has indeed understood. In this way, the Venerable Kondana acquired the name Anakondana, Kondana who has understood.
So, that was the first sermon. I'm not going to even attempt the correct name for this. There's no way my American mind is going to pronounce that correctly, but it's also called the first sermon. So, let's talk a bit about the name as a starting point. So, first of all, could you pronounce the correct name for this?
Yes, the correct pronunciation especially for English speakers, is best spoken by breaking this up into its component parts. So the name is the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta.
All right. Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta.
That's correct.
Is that okay. Cool. So what does that literally mean? Okay, well, I see it in the translation. Setting the wheel of the Dharma in motion, I guess?
Yeah. So this name comes from the idea that this very first sermon after the Buddha's enlightenment is the first instance of our historical Buddha, Shakyamuni, or Siddhartha Gautama, turning the Dharma wheel. And what the Dharma wheel is and what it means to turn it are very critical and important for Buddhist scriptural studies and textual studies, because there are lots of different claims over the course of early Buddhist history and then on into later Buddhist history, lots of different claims from people who say that this or that was a turning of the Dharma wheel. But essentially, what that translates to, what that means for the doctrine, is that a Buddha is providing some incredibly enlightening teaching. It's like fueling knowledge of the Dharma, fueling knowledge of the truth, priming the pump, so to speak, if the pump is like humanity or all sentient beings, for the Dharma to be known and spread and understood, and for beings to attain nirvana. And so on teaching the very first unique, distinct Buddhist fundamental concepts of the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and the Middle Way, the Buddha is beginning the period, or I guess renewing the period in human existence, in our concept of time, where the Dharma is studied and practiced and understood and realized and developed.
So one thing that I found a lot of things interesting, but one thing that stuck out to me, why does the Buddha refer to himself as the Tathagata?
That's a good question. So there are many different titles and names for a Buddha, someone who has attained the highest level of enlightenment. One of those is Buddha, of course, but another one is Tathagata.
Tathagata.
That translates to the thus become one, or in fact, because of a grammatical point in the original language, the thus left one, or the thus departed one. It's because many languages have this weird relationship between the verbs to come and to go. And so it's kind of playing into Buddhist doctrine a little bit to call him this by saying, is he the thus become one? Because in his enlightenment, he has thusly become, I don't know, real or true, or understood the true nature of reality? Or is he the thus departed one, or thus left one? Because upon attaining enlightenment, he suddenly overcame the cycle of birth and death, the cycle of rebirth and reincarnation, and has departed from this world, from samsara, for all eternity. But essentially, the title Tathagata doesn't just apply to our own historical Siddhartha Gautama. It actually applies to all Buddhas. In fact, we've talked in brief before about Gotra theory. There's the theory that there are the four lineages, or the four descendants. Of course, those are those of an undefined Gotra, those of the Bodhisattva Gotra, those of the Shravaka Gotra, those of the Pratyekya Buddhas, and then the other one is the family of the Tathagatas, or the Buddhas, right? So everyone who becomes a Buddha, and has become a Buddha, and will become a Buddha in any amount of time, they are part of this lineage, or this family, or this clan of Tathagatas.
Okay, and I suspect the interplay between to go and what did you say? To go and to come?
Yes.
Yeah, I suspect that was probably an intentional part of that word.
More or less. It's hard to say, because whenever you start to go to the roots of Pali and Sanskrit, you start to lose extant sources, meaning that philology, or the study of the origin and change of meanings of words and language over time, or etymology, the history of a particular sound or word. Those become exponentially more difficult the further back you go in time. And so it's very similar to how verbs like to do, or to come and to go, or to be. These are almost always irregular verbs in other languages. Irregular in the sense that they don't conjugate or function the same exact way that other verbs like to run or to eat function. And that's common among many, many, many languages all over the world, simply because those verbs are used a lot more. And so to that end, they become changed more over time. They become more irregular. Constant use and constant employment leads to these sorts of changes over time with regards to verbs, or it can lead to preservation of things that might have been regular in the past but are no longer regular. So that there's a lot of factors that play into the etymology of this word Tathagata.
The next bit I found particularly interesting was when he lays out the various noble truths. So this set of lines that goes, this is the noble truth of suffering. The next line is, the noble truth of suffering is to be fully understood. The next line is, the noble truth of suffering has been fully understood. I had to very closely examine these sentences because there are obviously a lot of elements that are the same between each sentence. Mm-hmm. But then you look closer and go, oh, but there are also really subtle differences that are super important.
Absolutely.
This would be a difficult set of sentences for me to understand spoken, which is why I'm very glad we had this to read. Because, yeah, I actually went through and, figured out what is the repeated elements of each sentence and then which elements are changed.
It's good that you did that, because especially these early sermons, these early sutras, they all very much have this repetitive formulaic structure, as we've talked about, for the purpose of being remembered and recited in a ritualistic fashion. And to that end, you're right that these small differences and the what stays the same and what changes in the repeated structure factors heavily into the doctrine that the sutra is trying to teach. And so what you did is what I suggest everybody do with these sutras, is not to just read over those repeated spots, because those spots typically have one word or one piece that's different than the previous one, especially because translators nowadays often, they will cut out repeated spots that are the same as other repeated spots. That happened a lot in the Satipatthana Sutta that we read before. The translator often didn't include these repeated structures that did not have any changes. So if it's an included repeated structure, there's probably something different in it. And that's an important thing to hone in on, because as you know, with the Four Noble Truths and each of their actionable components and the completion of those actionable components, that factors heavily into what the meaning of the truth itself that is being referred to is.
So this isn't just passive reading. One has to actually really engage with these. It is nice that let me rephrase that. I appreciate the translators occasionally adding ellipses to indicate it's what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And it's good to note that the lack of that is probably important as well.
Yes, exactly. These translators are including or not including these repeated structures on purpose. There's a real reason why. And sometimes, very rarely, it can be a reason such as they have an agenda, right? So some organizations who translate these texts are also interpreting them in a very clearly biased way, to where oftentimes they are adding or subtracting things from the original text for their own means. But to that end, of course, all translations are bad translations. That's what they teach me in graduate school, is that there is no perfect translation of an original text, because by nature, all translation is interpretation, because there's words in the original text that simply do not have a one-word equivalent in English. And sometimes they don't even have a 2-word or 3-word or 10-word equivalent. And that's very true in Buddhist sutras especially. This is why we've run into issues like the translation of emptiness or the translation of suffering from shunyata and dukkha, respectively. Those words are very, very, very complicated, and they mean a lot. And what's happened is European translators who are interpreting these concepts in terms of their own European philosophies, such as nihilism, phenomenology, fatalism, what have you, they are looking at these and seeing what they've already seen before. They are seeing an unfamiliar space, and they are filling it with a familiar concept. And so all translations are bad, but some are better than others. So to that end, be mindful of what is included and what's not included. And if you have the opportunity or the chance or the ability, it's often good to have the original text to look at as well. Even if you can't read it word for word, just knowing that, for example, what is often translated as suffering corresponds with the word dukkha. Just knowing that much, you can see if dukkha comes up in the original but not in the translation, or vice versa, something fishy's going on.
I found it interesting, the addition of traditionally Hindu deities into this story. In the setup for this, it's stated that Brahma is attempting to convince the Buddha to actually share these truths because he doesn't believe at the start of this that he's going to be able to communicate these, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And so at the end of this, we have Kondana. Is that his name?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So at the end of this, Kondana understands what the Buddha is getting to and then reaches enlightenment from these words. And that's also the Buddha's proof that, like, this can be taught, right?
The Buddha had proof with himself, but having others around to witness that this teaching causes enlightenment in a being, in a sentient being, namely a god, a Hindu god, that offers credibility to what he's saying. And so there's a polemical reason why these Hindu gods like Brahma and Kundana are included here.
Is Kundana a deity? I thought that was one of the ascetics. Maybe I misunderstood that.
That might be one of the ascetics. I don't remember all of their names.
Gotcha.
But either way, there is the Hindu god Brahma, and there is the issue of witnessing Kundana's enlightenment. Because, of course, those who know, they know, right? That the Buddha became enlightened by realizing these truths. But in terms of spreading the Dharma and validating the Dharma and proving the Dharma and garnering trust and confidence in the Dharma among others who have not come to know it yet, having this episode where you can witness the Buddha saying these things and someone becoming enlightened, that's proof for other people, proof for other sentient beings who have never heard of this, who have no idea what's going on, who, for them, they didn't even know that Buddhahood existed, that enlightenment existed, that it was something that they could learn about and practice towards.
One last question, or rather comment that I had. And at the end of this, we go very cosmic, where announcement of this completion of the first sermon is, let's see, what's their term? And when the wheel of the Dhamma had been set in motion by the Blessed One, the earth-dwelling devas raised a cry. And then it goes through the various others. Then we go to the devas of the realm of the four great kings. Mm-hmm. And then the Tabatimsa devas. Like, there a bunch of different devas are celebrating the setting in motion of the wheel of the Dharma.
Mm-hmm.
One term that was interesting to me that I, just as a writer who is interested in this kind of storytelling, a term that stuck out to me, the 10,000-fold world system.
Yeah.
What's going on here?
So all of these issues, or all of these points that you bring up, such as the presence of Brahma and the different devas that are mentioned and the 10,000-fold world, all of these are related to each other. What happens in this sermon, there's a couple of different levels to this. The first level is whenever the Buddha becomes enlightened, he has suddenly realized that he's tasted chocolate, and he could never explain chocolate in words to someone who's never tasted chocolate. But now Brahma, this Hindu god who has gone from being the top of the Hindu pantheon to being kind of like the Buddha's attendant, the Buddha's butler, so to speak, is pressing him to. He's saying, you have to do this. You have to show what you know to everybody else. And so he does. And when he does, he successfully conveys, at least in part, the flavor of chocolate to everyone there, and fully conveys it to lucky Kundana in the audience. Because he set this Dharma wheel in motion, and because he has renewed learning in the Dharma and understanding and practice in the Dharma, all of the realms of the Hindu cosmology, all of them quake, and there's a bright light, and there's all of these natural things. There's a bunch of thunder and music and all this stuff. And all of this is, again, polemical to lend credibility and superiority and grandeur to the teaching that's being espoused here. So this is very typical of all Buddhist sutras, not just the early ones, where when the Buddha says a teaching, all of these gods in all of these different heavens and cosmos, they all rejoice, they all celebrate, and there's all of these natural disasters almost. There's earthquakes and thunder, and the earth sometimes, like the land, turns over and all of this other stuff. And in addition to that, there's also like music. So sometimes this like divine holy music will come out of nowhere. And in addition to the gods and the people celebrating, even the animals and the hungry ghosts and all of these other lower beings, according to the Buddhist cosmology, will celebrate and rejoice. And all of that's always documented in these sutras to offer more credibility and to offer a kind of fantastical and spectacular divine mood to the sutras. So the 10,000-fold world, it'll often come up, but it's the interpenetrating Hindu cosmos, right? So in this reality, there's 10,000 other realities, and those are all accessible through Hindu practice, right?
I see.
And so that's often employed, but it changes. And that's the other level that's going on with this sutra. In addition to having the credibility and superiority issue, if you think of this the way that a lot of old European scholars think of Buddhism, you can think of this doctrine as a response to the overarching Brahmanical or Hindu philosophy of the time. So what a lot of old European scholars of Buddhism did is they read these suttas as a philosophy to contest Brahmanical philosophy. To that end, you can see why they might take the top of the Hindu pantheon and put him as like the Buddha's lowly attendant, right? Because they're trying to demonstrate symbolically the superiority of the Buddhist teaching. So that's the other level, is that they're trying to respond to and contest and, I guess, rub up against the Brahmanical tradition. And that's also evident in the story of the Buddha's life, right? Because he spends time with Brahmanical ascetics. He spends time with a lot of people who are teaching some of the things that end up being Hinduism. And he has lots of critiques of them, and he's not satisfied by their teachings. And he goes off to do something else because he didn't think that they were enough. And so whenever he goes off and reaches his own enlightenment, then it serves his own agenda, serves his own polemical bend on this, to have the Hindu gods rejoicing and bowing down and offering alms and rejoicing and all that other good stuff.
And I suspect from hearing this that there are a fair number of Hindu folks who are not amused by this idea.
Even so, to this day, we have, the two of us in our other Discord server, we've encountered that before. There have been some who they outright reject emptiness, for example. Emptiness is one of the biggest responses to Hindu philosophy, because Hindu philosophy is where we see the foundation of things like atomism, atomism.
It's the term we get the term atom from, right?
Yes, exactly. This term, and it's pretty revolutionary and ahead of its time, and it's a very interesting schema for looking at the world. But it holds that all things as they are made up of infinitesimally small particles which do not undergo change over time. They only rearrange themselves. And so that basically means that everything in some way has a permanent and unchanging self. And then you can see how you get from there to an argument for the existence of a soul and things like that. And that's their explanation for reincarnation, is this rearrangement, right? Because Hinduism, early Brahmanical philosophy, also believes in reincarnation. The reason for that is because they believe in permanence rather than in impermanence. And emptiness and impermanence are direct responses to those teachings. The Buddha says, no, there is no such thing as an infinitesimally small particle that undergoes no change over time. Everything is empty of inherent self and is always changing, right? And he's kind of right about that. If you look at it from a scientific perspective. I don't often like to reach into modern science to offer validation and proof for Buddhism or anything religious, really. But we find even that atoms change, that atoms rearrange, that atoms undergo transformation over a long scale of time. And in fact, we also find that atoms are mostly empty space, right? They are... Right. The distance between a nucleus and the electron is quite large, and electrons are infinitesimally small. And so to that end, every atom is a neutron, which is mostly empty space, and electrons, which are mostly empty space. And so we see that most everything is actually made up of nothing. So it's very interesting to see this kind of dialogue going on 2,500 years ago, before Niels Bohr came and proposed a theory of the atom. Yeah, so let's jump into some other discussion points that I've included here. Yeah. One discussion point is that early Buddhist traditions, they hold that this is the first sermon, the very first sermon after the Buddha's enlightenment. So they literally hold that after the Buddha had sat under the Bodhi tree for 49 days, that he turned around and preached this after having his discussion with Brahma about whether or not to discuss it. However, later Buddhist schools, particularly in China, they hold that this is actually his second sermon. This school that I'm referring to is called the Huayan school. Huayan is spelled in English Huayan. And that school, the name of that school translates to the flower garland. And the reason why they believe that that was the first teaching is because if you read the Flower Garland Sutra, like we will, you find that it's a complete trip. Like, it is out of this world. I mean, it's first off, I think it's like 1,000 pages in English. So we're obviously going to only be reading a selection of it. And in addition to that, it is trippy, if ever there was such a thing as a trippy sutra. And there are plenty, but this one takes the cake. This one has a narrative in it, but for the most part, it's just a lot of exploration of pratitya samutpada, which translates to interpenetration. The Flower Garland Sutra is where people go to find this metaphor of Indra's net. Indra is this Hindu god who has this net full of jewels, and every jewel is reflected in every other jewel. And that reflects one of the central teachings of the Flower Garland Sutra, this teaching of interdependence, or in Pali, pratitya samutpada. I'll put resources for that in the episode whenever we read from there. But essentially, they think that the Buddha preached that first because he was trying to convey enlightenment without using skillful means. As we've talked about, skillful means, or upaya, is saying things not because they are perhaps capital T true, but because they lead someone to capital T truth. You're employing the right language and the right words and the right causes and conditions, or the right setting, the right environment, the right space for people to reach truth on their own. And so then once he realized that he completely confused so many people from his Flower Garland sermon, and he spoke with Brahma and decided he still had to do this, he switched to using skillful means and began to teach according to the Four Noble Truths. He tried to break it down to the very lowest, most accessible level that he possibly could to get people started on the path. And then eventually, of course, he would go on to preach the Flower Garland Sutra again. And people were apparently much more able to understand it at the time. So that's an interesting thought, thinking about where this falls into the history of the Buddha's teaching. Obviously, because of the popularity of Buddhism and the sheer number of Buddhist schools in the world, the history of the Buddha's teaching, which sermon came in which order, that's highly contested. And this is one of the major points of contention right here. Is this the first sermon or the second?
And then different schools just have different answers to that question?
Yes. Oftentimes the late Mahayana schools in China, Korea, Japan, they often think that this is the second and that the flower garland is the first. And earlier schools in India and Nepal, and also I think Tibetan schools as well, they believe that this was the first sermon. In addition to that, we talked a little bit about the Four Noble Truths being repeated and having a repetitive structure. And I wanted to call attention back to that because each noble truth has an actionable component. So it's not only that these things are true, it's that you have to do something about it. For example, the first noble truth of the existence of suffering, you're not supposed to necessarily understand the truth itself because that's easy. I can understand a declaration about reality. You're supposed to fully understand suffering. What is dukkha? And if you fully understand it, you actually come to realize that it's not suffering. It's not good by any means, but it's definitely not the English word suffering. It's interesting that the translators have decided to use that word. But anyways, the second noble truth, you're not supposed to read that noble truth and abandon it, right? So I've read it and now I'm going to walk away. Actually, abandoning desire. You're abandoning desire as the cause of suffering. So in addition, the third noble truth is not to be realized. So if you've read it and someone else has said it and you've heard it, you haven't realized it yourself. It's not like, oh no, I haven't realized it, so I guess I screwed up on that one. You actually have to realize the existence of the cessation of suffering. Similarly, fourth noble truth itself is not to be developed because you have read it, it's there. You're supposed to develop the Eightfold Path. So all four of these noble truths are, the actionable component is referring to what the truth is referring to, right? So that's a linguistic issue. What is the object of the verb? And in this case, the object is implied, the thing that is being referred to, rather than the sentence or the truth itself. And so that's the foundation for Buddhist practice, the very earliest first foundation of Buddhist practice, except for those lucky people who, if you believe that the Flower Garland Sutra came first, listened to that and were able to become enlightened. But that was a very lucky few. In fact, most of the people who heard that sermon were extremely confused. And even that is documented in the text itself. It's very trippy, and whenever we read it, you'll understand why it's kind of confusing and why people might pressure the Buddha to use more skillful means afterward.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Some other points to bring up for this sutra, for the first sermon or the second sermon. Returning to this concept of the Dharma wheel. One of the things that's important to remember with this Dharma wheel issue is the question of why can the Buddha turn it? Can anybody turn it? Can somebody come up with some teaching and that is a turning of the Dharma wheel? According to Buddhists, no, not everybody can turn it. When the Buddha was born, he was prophesied to be either a great teacher or a Chakravartin king. Chakra, or Chakka, is the middle of the title of the sutra, Dhammacakkappavattana. And that Chakka is the wheel. A Chakravartin is a wheel-turning king. So a wheel-turning king is a king who puts the Dharma into practice. And a teacher is obviously someone who teaches the Dharma. And the prophecy was that he was going to become one or the other. And of course, his father wanted him to become the king, and he ended up becoming the teacher. But ultimately, in the end, he becomes both, because he's a teacher who can also turn the Dharma wheel. And so, in the Buddhist doctrine, there's this turning of the Dharma wheel, which most Buddhist people agree that this is a turning of the Dharma wheel, a valid one. But many others come much later, and those ones are contested. The Lotus Sutra, the Buddha's death, several other episodes in the Buddha's life are supposedly turnings of the Dharma wheel. And whether or not people accept that these are turnings of the Dharma wheel is dependent on whether they accepted the sutra itself. So the Lotus Sutra, which we will again read selections of in a later time and discuss later, that one claims to be a turning of the Dharma wheel. And yet many Buddhist schools reject the validity of that sutra, and they rejected the teaching of that sutra. And there's a lot of good reasons why. They have a lot of basis for rejecting it. However, it's also still very popular, and it's the most copied and recited sutra in all of East Asia. And so to that end, many people still do believe it's a turning of the Dharma wheel. And so this issue of like the Buddha has to keep the Dharma wheel turning, that begs the question, what happens when it's lost its momentum, when it has ceased to turn, when it's not spinning on its spokes anymore? And that's the foundation for this character, Maitreya. Some of you might have heard of Maitreya before. His name in Chinese is Mile, and his name in Japanese is Miroku. Maitreya is the Buddha of the future. So whenever all of Shakyamuni Buddha's teachings or Siddhartha's teachings have been forgotten and have been lost to time, and no one can remember them, no one is doing Dharma anymore, no one is doing Buddhism anymore, when the Dharma has finally stopped in the world of sentient beings, Maitreya will come and he will do the exact same things all over again. So he will come and he will preach Four Noble Truths. He will come and preach the Eightfold Path, and he will live an identical lifetime to the Buddha, to the historical Shakyamuni Buddha. So that means that he will be born a prince. He will see aging, illness, and death, and then he will leave the castle or the palace and sit under a Bodhi tree and do all the same things that the Buddha did. It's very important that I mentioned that he's going to live an exact copy of the life of Shakyamuni Buddha, because all Buddhas allegedly live the exact same life. And this is not just symbolically. This is quite literally, someone will be born near Vulture Peak, this place where the Buddha preaches a lot in India, in the sutras, and they will be born to this specific royal family, etc. So they all live the same life as our historical Buddha. And that will be the next turning of the Dharma wheel after the spinning of this one has stopped. The current Dharma wheel turn is still spinning. We still have some momentum on it. It has slowed down because the historical Buddha has died and has been long gone. However, we're still talking about Buddhism. We still are reading the teachings, and there's still Buddhists in the world doing rituals, reading sutras, copying them, reciting them, teaching about them, doing all of that, all of the Buddhist stuff. And so the Dharma is still alive in our world today. And as long as it is, that means that we still have some momentum from the last time that it was spun. But when it runs out, never fear, Maitreya will come down from where he lives now, waiting, the Tushita heaven, and he will spin it again. Thank you for listening. This has been the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, or the first sermon, or maybe the second sermon, depending on your perspective. We hope you found this interesting. Join us next time when we discuss a Buddhist scriptural text and read it, either in its entirety or in selection. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Our email is bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com.
You can find us on Twitter at Bright Buddhism.
As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.